Welcome back, everybody. Just turning 7 minutes past 1. Picture this. A man walks out of a prison in Northern Ireland. Say it's a Friday afternoon. And he has been assessed as a serious offender in the past. He's high risk. He has no GP. He has no bank account. Sometimes a man in this situation being released will have no ID at all. No confirmed place to stay. And staff at the hostel that should be there to take him in are doing whatever they can, but there is no bed for him. So he sleeps rough. He's homeless. Straight away. That's not hypothetical. Inspectors in Northern Ireland have found examples of that happening here. And today, a follow-up report from the Criminal Justice Inspection Northern Ireland says that 3 years after the system was told to put that kind of thing right, not one of their 4 recommendations has been fully delivered. The number of supervised hostel beds across the whole of Northern Ireland has not increased. It remains 91, just 91. But the number of high-risk offenders needing a place on release from prison has been rising. Jacqui Durkin is the Chief Inspector of Criminal Justice in Northern Ireland. Jacqui, welcome.
Thank you.
Good to have you here with us.
William.
What has gone wrong?
Well, I think, first of all, I think it's important to say that the work that Approved Premises and the staff who work in it do is highly valued in the criminal justice system. They support people who are released from prison who need that enhanced supervision and monitoring when they're released into the community. So this inspection report that I published back in March 2023 had 4 recommendations, 1 strategic recommendation for the key partners to work together. So that's the Department of Justice, Reducing Offending Division, Probation Board, Police and the Public Protection Arrangements, and the Housing Executive, who, through the Department for Communities Fund, through their Supporting People programme, fund the places. So we all know and we've had a lot of discussion over recent months about the rising prison population. And when we go back to look at a follow-up review, as I would often include in the inspection programme, to go and look and do a follow-up review and say, how have these recommendations been implemented? We were disappointed to find that the strategic recommendation, while there had been some work done, seemed to only really gather pace since the beginning of field work, hadn't been gripped, and we assessed it as not achieved. And the 3 operational recommendations, which are really kind of should be quick wins and quick things to do, were partially implemented. So it's disappointing that progress has been so slow, particularly in our community when we know there's a demand for places. From the small sample of cases that inspectors looked at in the case file reviews, they found 1 case where a person who was under public protection arrangements was released homeless into the community. And that, to my view, is completely unacceptable. How do you possibly supervise somebody who is homeless? So those are some of the issues that we're grappling with. Everyone who's involved in the criminal justice system is grappling with. And we need to make sure that there's a proper assessment of the need for provision, that the vision and the strategy for these services is well known and understood. And that includes engaging with the Approved Premises providers and making sure they're in the room and part of the conversation about what the future of these services looks like.
So can you give us a sense of the kind of the categories of offences we're talking about, and in terms of those who are being released, in your view, in a way, and I'll quote you here, in a way that's unacceptable? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, I can't talk about individual cases.
Of course not. Categories.
Categories of cases in terms under the public protection arrangements. So we know that roughly about 46% of people who are in approved premises are subject to the public protection arrangements in Northern Ireland, and that includes people who've been convicted of violent and sexual offences. And that can be Category 2 or Category 3. Category 2 people have an identified risk that need to be supervised by a key worker working in tandem with the police and other people who are involved in their supervision and monitoring. And Category 3 there's there's a risk of serious harm and they need intense supervision while they're in approved premises and when they're released into the community. But we also know there is...
It's shocking. You could have someone who is a child sex offender who needs to be carefully monitored, surveilled sometimes, certainly monitored and worked with under licence when they're released. And that person could find themselves living homeless on release from a prison. Well,
I think that's where the partnership working between probation and the approved premises providers and the police kicks in to say, what is the type of offence that this person has been convicted for and is being released to an approved premise, and look at, is there anybody who's leaving? Is it possible to get them in? So it's not necessarily people convicted of child sexual offences.
It could be.
It could be, but and I think what's important in
or other
the sample,
violent crimes.
Well, that in terms of violence, that is a big increase in terms of the Category 2 violent offenders and the demand for places in approved premises and people who had been convicted of violent offences and assessed as Category 2 that were in approved premises and needed to be there.
Do you think someone in those categories, high risk offenders, should actually be released from prison if there is no appropriate assessed accommodation arranged for them?
Well, that's a risk that has to be managed, and obviously parole commissioners have a role in deciding whether a person is appropriate. It's appropriate to release them under conditions and under licence, and part of that is about where they are going to live. So not everybody who is released from prison under licence needs an approved premise place. Neither, as I said earlier, not everybody in an approved premise has been convicted of a violent or sexual offence. So those are the types of issues that need to be considered through the public protection arrangements, and saying who really needs a place here, what are the risks, how are we going to manage them.
You say in this report, this work now needs to be gripped, and in the spirit of authentic collaboration, all organisations must recognise and agree what needs to be done together. Why has it not been gripped?
I think what we've heard from inspected organisations is that some work has taken place. A strategic working group was established.
Clearly not gripped.
There were three, I was just going to come on that, there were 3 work streams around data, so trying to assess what the demand for places would be, looking at training and look at other aspects of the recommendations that need to be implemented. But there will always be competing priorities. There will always be more work than potentially there are people to do it, and I am very disappointed that the strategic recommendation, when there is that foreseeability of who's in prison, what they've been convicted of, are they likely to need an approved premises place on when they're released, about making sure that the model for service delivery is known and agreed, and training is in place for people who need to really provide high quality services to monitor and supervise people when they are released into the community.
So you recognised these problems 3 years ago. You put 4 key recommendations in place, strategic and operationally, to try to fix this, or get the people who can fix it to fix it. And there hasn't been sufficient progress in order to do that, to meet that test. Can you do anything about that? Is this the end of your work, simply calling attention to it?
No, because what I'm doing about it is publishing this report today to highlight where there needs to be more momentum. And I think there has been, since we were engaged in inspection fieldwork and review fieldwork, and there has been, even as lately as the report publication just prior to it, when organisations get the draft report, they know the recommendations, and in this case, I believe, has galvanised activity and action. And the strategic group that was established to take forward the strategic recommendation, I believe there has been a framework agreed to and will be tabled for agreement later this month.
There's also been failure for 3 years. to fully implement these recommendations?
I think work started and it didn't gather momentum. It didn't get the focus. It didn't get the priority that
it's very generous of you.
Well, I think they
haven't done the job.
I think it's important to be balanced in these things and to recognise where there is an opportunity to work collectively, and that's why I said about authentic collaboration, because it's very easy to talk about good partnerships. It's a bit more harder to actually deliver against them. But what I'm saying very clearly is enough's enough. They need to grip these recommendations, look at the prison population and what the demand for services are going to be, and try and make sure that there is no one who is released from prison in Northern Ireland who's subject to public protection arrangements that is released homeless. And the other thing that I am doing is we are about to start inspection on public protection arrangements in Northern Ireland, and the work that we've done here will help inform that inspection.
There was a Court of Appeal ruling last December on this precise issue of releasing prisoners into the community without confirmed accommodation. Now, I know it's quite difficult. I've tried my best to kind of summarise what it says. It's quite difficult to implement that ruling. What's your interpretation of what that ruling means?
Well, that was a ruling around about no uncertainty about the arrangements for a person on release. So it wasn't it would be good to have, it was a must have. So I think it was Article 28. I'm looking to Stephen here. I'm sure he probably has it off the top of his head. It was Article 28 of the Criminal Justice Order 2008. And it was a challenge to that to say, could the parole commissioners make a decision on about someone's release on the anticipation that something would be provided and a place for them in approved premise would be provided, rather than they must know for sure that when that person, they're making a decision about release, that person has a place to go to.
But does it at least follow from that ruling that you ought not to be releasing prisoners into the community in these categories unless there is a confirmed assessed accommodation arranged?
Yeah, and what I've said, William, is that's a decision for the parole commissioner, so they get the evidence on the person's risk, about how they're going to be monitored and supervised in the community, and that's like a quasi-judicial decision for them to make and say, on this basis, is it safe to release Jacqui Durkin back into the community? And I think that's something that is individual to that person. Of course, they have to look at the offence, they have to look at their conduct while they've been in custody, and they have to look at the security of accommodation and how that supervision is going to be carried out by a key worker and their probation officer on release.
I told you that judgment was difficult to summarise, but you've done a very good job doing it for us, Jacqui. Along with Jacqui, she's just pre-advertised Stephen's presence, Stephen Hamilton, who's Director of Operations at the Probation Board. Welcome back, Stephen. On that point, do you think, just as a basic principle, we should never do this? We should never release into the community someone in these high-risk categories without proper accommodation in place?
So, first of all, good afternoon, William, and good afternoon, Jacqui. So, unfortunately, it is not as simple as that. I wish it was, but there are some cases, depending on the type of prison sentence that is imposed, that will have an end date regardless of their risk, and that is the situation we find ourselves in on occasion. The cases that you and Jacqui are referring to are cases where the parole commissioner has discretion on whether or not to release, and I totally accept your point, and that is in fact probation's role in pre-release parole hearings, where we have to make a judgment call as to whether somebody is safe, can be safely managed in the community. But there are some cases where that question isn't asked and there is an endpoint anyway, and those are called determinate custodial sentences. And there are sometimes people with sexual convictions and harmful convictions who are subject to those licences. And for that reason, I suppose, that I should let you ask your question, William, but that is why approved premises are so important in terms of pre-release planning, to make sure there are places available for those individuals as well as those released by the commissioners.
Approved premises being appropriate accommodation for the kinds of categories of offences we are talking about here. For example, you may be able to find an apartment, but it's right there next door to a primary school, and for some of the categories of offences we're talking about, that would be completely inappropriate, so it wouldn't be an approved accommodation for that person. Have you any idea how many we need? We've only got 91.
So there is a substantial amount of planning work, and by the way, just could I say, I fully accept the challenge that Jacqui and the Criminal Justice Inspection has set us in terms of gripping the requirements of this strategic recommendation. And one part of it, as you absolutely point out, is the quantum, and that's the number of approved premises places we need. And we know that the prison population is on the increase. We know that the complexity of individuals is on the is getting more difficult to manage. So at the minute we have 91 places across Northern Ireland, and I do want to say that isn't an end point. There is each one of those 91 beds are logistically managed. It's 91 plates in there effectively, where we are saying you are now assessed as appropriate to move on and to free up a bed for someone else. So we're constantly trying to move that set of always competing priorities.
Why are we stuck at 91?
So we're at 91 because that is what's currently funded, and we're currently working through the work required to make a business case for more places. But just to make the point, and I think Jacqui was making it...
You could have made a business case 3 years ago, couldn't you?
Well...
Same number, 91 then.
Yeah, the complexity of this piece is...
Why didn't you make a business case 3 years ago?
So... I'm here to speak for the Probation Board, not the entire system. But we would...
Yeah, I know, but there's a lot of bureaucratic talk going on here. Ultimately, this is failing, and the Criminal Justice Review here is it needs to be gripped, it needs to be fixed. I'm wondering if this is a failure of structures, of leadership, of imagination, of moral focus. What the heck? So 3 years.
Yeah. So within that 3 year period, I would want to say there has been a lot of work done. I don't want to use a phrase like fixing the plane whilst flying it, but there is an element of that.
No, I get that. It's complicated.
Yeah, but if you just let me say, at this stage, there are a multitude of partners around this table, and just this is not an excuse. Just let me explain it. So the approved premises themselves are run by the community and voluntary sector. So that's Exeter and Simon Community and others. The money is from Supporting People, which is a funding stream under the Housing Executive and Department of Communities. The customer, as it were, is the Probation Board, where we are saying we need more than 91 beds in order to manage these people coming through the prison. But there is not a bottomless pit of money. So whilst we can say that, and we are having those discussions regularly, it is certainly not that nothing's happened over 3 years, but there's work ongoing to really understand the evidence base for increasing that. I mean, I do want to make the point that I wouldn't want any perception that there are risky cases being released that are not living in accommodation approved by PBNI. So that scenario you give at the outset, William, that is not a scenario that certainly I welcome, but also it's not a scenario that I recognise.
The report mentions two similar scenarios.
As I said, was said earlier, the small sample of cases that inspectors reviewed, they came across one case where they had been released homeless. But what I should say is, as well, speaking to, so not only case file reviews, but part of the evidence, this follow-up review was about speaking to stakeholders like probation officers and approved premises staff and other stakeholders, and they certainly didn't feel it was an isolated case.
Right.
And that's why it was so important to do this work in relation to strategic recommendation, to make sure there was a clear and shared understanding of what future service provision could look like and how current service provision could be improved. So that's not just about people who are coming through from prison and that, as I say, predictability and foreseeability that they're likely to need an approved premises place, but it's also about for the approved premises service providers to say, well, what's likely to be the profile of people who need our services and that we have to manage.
Upshot though, is the public at greater risk because of the failings here?
I think that has to be managed carefully, and I think because when you look at...
Yes?
Well, I don't have enough information to say for certain that they are or they're not. I can only provide an evidence-based report and a review of what we've done to look at how those recommendations are being implemented.
But to be fair, you're putting in recommendations that you say are necessary to manage risk downwards.
Yeah.
The recommendations have not been fully implemented. Doesn't it follow logically from that the public is at greater risk?
Well, the work we do is about providing assurance and about identifying areas for improvement. And we identified areas for improvement and made those recommendations, which have not been progressed at the pace and the grip that they should have, by the organisations involved in public protection arrangements and through the housing executive and the approved premises providers. And one of the key issues around is about the inclusion of approved premises staff in those supervision and management arrangements, to make sure that if someone's in an approved premises place, that their risks are managed appropriately, but their risks are regularly reviewed
of course
by
they
probation
would be.
officers.
Of course, but I don't see the point of putting recommendations in to manage risk if, when they're not implemented, these recommendations, we can't conclude that risks are higher than they should be. Is there a coordinating authority, Stephen, around the many different groups and departments involved in this issue? Who is that?
There is now. It's led by the Department of Justice. Probation sit on that, along with Housing Executive, Police, Public Protection colleagues. But William, I'm conscious of our time, and I really do have to address that point about increased risk to the public, and what I was referencing earlier about not recognising. What I mean by that is, if we have a scenario where an individual is under licensed supervision and they are homeless or otherwise, and we cannot manage their risks, either because they're not on approved premises or because they're resuming their relationship that they cause harm in. Whatever those reasons are, we have a statutory duty to return that case to the Parole Commissioner in order for that person to be returned to prison. So I really need to make that point strongly about the fact that the risk of harm may be an issue, but the point is it's instantly addressed.
The Justice Minister has said to us, the report shows while progress has been made, more needs to be done. Since the beginning of this year, work to progress the recommendations has been given new impetus through focused resource, and this work has proceeded at pace. Well, you say from the beginning of this year, Justice Minister. What about 3 years ago when you first got these recommendations? And the Housing Executive say they very much recognise the importance of strong partnership working and responding to the pressures, and will remain fully committed to doing this joint work and playing their part in it. There is another aspect to this, just as we close though, Stephen. Is it possible then we could have someone who's a prisoner who is ready to be released but cannot yet be released because we don't have the accommodation for them?
That is absolutely...
That's an injustice too.
That is a really difficult issue, and that's the less frequent of the two, but that does happen, absolutely. And to be fair, it is not that person's fault that there isn't a bed for them at that stage. Hence the need for a move on and constant logistics of freeing up a bed as soon as possible for them. But yeah, that is an absolute concern from that perspective, from the prisoner's perspective.
I've only got 40 seconds, Jacqui, but on this particular issue, I know your department does so many different investigations, but in this one, do you come back to this again and find out if there is progress?
Well, as I said earlier, the public protection inspection that we're starting very shortly will include aspects of this as well, and how those public protection arrangements are operating. As I say, hopeful that they will provide assurance, because there is a lot of good work going on, but there is a lot of work to do, and that's been recognised by all involved.
We'll get an update. We'll get a review of the review. And you'll get you back in here.
You'll get a new inspection on public protection arrangements.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.